Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president and I'm so excited to be here tonight. We have a series called Three Historians Walk into a Saloon. We knew that we couldn't just name this after each immigration law. It wouldn't be quite as appealing, so we came up with this catchy title, but it's a little problematic tonight, I have to admit. Full disclosure, I'm not here with three historians. I'm here with one historian and two sociologists. Actually, a historian, a sociologist, and an anthropologist. And sociologists. I don't know. Here we are. Whoever we are, accept us for what we are. And I will actually do a formal introduction in a second. But I want to thank, before we get started, I want to thank the New York Department of Cultural Affairs and the National Park Foundation for funding this program. It's a series that began in September, but it began with looking at different immigration laws. We started with 1882, we moved on to look at 1924. Actually, we started even before that. We looked at the 15th Amendment, then we looked at 1882, then we looked at 1924, then 1948, and here we are in 1965. Time is flying as we analyze different moments in time, trying to understand who could get to this country, who could not get to this country, and how they were treated, and what were the debates about it in the background. So it's wonderful to be here tonight. Before I introduce our guests, I also want to thank all our members out there who have supported the Tenement Museum, and your support helps fund these programs, which are free, and we're very grateful to you. So if you're watching tonight and you'd like to become a member, please do. It enables you to visit the Tenement Museum over and over and over again, and as you will see, there are lots of reasons to visit the Tenement Museum. So with that, I want to introduce Nancy Foner. She's a distinguished professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Grad Center of CUNY, the City University of New York. She is the author of, I'm not joking, over 20 publications, the most recent of which is 1/3 of the nation. 1/3, of course, referring to the number.
It's 1/4.
1/4. It's 1/3 in New York. It's 1/3 of New York. There's another book. There is 1 out of 3 is another book. She's just doing this so I mention more of her publications. 1 out of 3, which is a book about New York City. And the newest book about the nation is 1/4 of the nation. And Mae Ngai, a professor of history at Columbia University. If you've been watching this series, she'll be familiar to you. She's been with us almost all along the way. And her most recent book is The Chinese Question. And also to my right is Margaret Chin, the author of Sewing Women and The Peer Effect. She's a professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Grad Center. And all three of these wonderful professors worked with us when we created an exhibit at 103 Orchard about post-World War II immigration and migration waves. So it's wonderful to be reunited with you tonight. So I know tonight is about 1965, but this is history, so we're going to go back a little bit. I promise we'll get to 1965. But tell us, Mae, a little bit about the 1924 law, because it was so important that 1965 was overturning a law set in 1924.
Right. Well, first, thank you, Annie, for having us again, and hello, everybody out there in Tenement Museum land. Yes, so the 65 law was significant because it was a major reform and repeal of standing law, which was the 1924 Act. So I'm not going to go on at length about the 1924 Act. You can look at the YouTube video we did about that. But 1924 was significant because it placed for the first time a numerical ceiling on the number of people who could come to the United States every year. Before that, there was no limit numerically. Before World War I, the annual average of new immigrants was 1 million a year. And the 1924 Act put a cap on that to 150,000. So that's 15% of the pre-war average. The other thing it did was that it decided it was going to distribute that 150,000 in a very complicated and differential formula, but basically it was based on national origins, so-called national origins, of white Americans, which it did in a very convoluted way, but in a way its effect was to say that people from Northern Europe had the biggest quotas, and people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, had the tiny quotas. And that was the purpose of the bill, was to restrict those immigrants from coming into the country. The other thing the 1924 Act did was that it perfected Asian exclusion. Asian exclusion had been piecemeal and incremental since the 1880s, but the 1924 Act made it a statutory requirement that no Asians could enter the country, full stop, period. So since World War II, the end of World War II, there was a long-running campaign to reform the law to repeal the national origin quotas. It was led by what we call the white ethnics, the Euro-American ethnic groups that had been most punished by the 1924 Act. Those groups were now in their second and third generation. They had become much more part of the American mainstream. The gap between their wages and native-born white wages was closing very quickly. And by the 1960s, they were a really important political bloc within the Democratic Party in the industrial and urban centers of the country. So it was with JFK and then LBJ, John Kennedy, of course, who sponsored immigration reform, and then Johnson took it up after Kennedy's assassination and passed this sweeping bill that reformed the 1924 Act. So what did the 1965 law do? It's most famous for its repeal of the national origin quotas, but how it replaced them was a little tricky. It seemed very simple and elegant and non-controversial at the time, but it basically said, rather than have discriminatory quotas, we're going to treat every country the same. Every country is going to have the same number of people it can send. And this was very much a piece of the civil rights era, right? This 65 immigration law was just after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it was very much infused with this notion of formal equality for all. But countries aren't individual people, right? So you say that Mexico now has the same quota as Belgium, and India now has the same quota as New Zealand. You can see that under this guise of treating everybody equally is actually a very unequal system, and that would have a lot of ramifications going forward. The other thing that the 1965 Act did was that it kept the numerical quota. And we don't often think about the numerical limits on immigration. We think about the quota, the countries, and the distribution. And it's become, I think, a real normative part of our immigration policy. Nobody questions the fact that we have to limit how many people come into the country. And so the 65 Act not only kept the numerical ceiling, it actually made it more restrictive because it included in its purview the countries of the Western Hemisphere, which previously had been exempt. And it did not raise the number significant. It only raised the number in proportion to the growth of the size of the population. So actually it was a more restrictive bill than previously. So those were the major features of the 65 Act. There are a lot of other things that we can get into the weeds later about family unification and employment and stuff like that. But basically it was a bill that was a radical departure from previous law in some ways, and in other ways it continued old policies. I think it was, on balance, a progressive law for some groups and a regressive law for other groups. It was both a liberal and an illiberal reform.
It was celebrated at the time, certainly, though, as a kind of an expansion, as you said, a kind of progression forward.
No, but actually it wasn't.
I have a quote here.
The proponents of the law said it's going to be fair and equal, but it's not going to change anything.
Right. They said that.
They said it was symbolic.
To go to some of the kind of the rhetoric and the speeches surrounding the law, right? We have this beautiful photo of LBJ surrounded by, I think, RFK, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy is in there as well. And they're at Liberty Island with the Statue of Liberty in the background and Ellis Island kind of at the other end. And he says, this bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. To your point, it does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives. We'll talk about that, whether that came true or not. Yet it is still one of the most important acts of this Congress and of this administration, for it does repair a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. So this is language that's kind of setting this law into the context of the civil rights movement. Nancy, tell me a little bit about kind of this law and how it might have been kind of viewed at the time by various groups.
Well, I'm not quite sure how is it viewed by various groups at the time, but I mean, it's known at least in the academic literature, as this classic case of, unintended consequences, because the people who signed the bill and developed it didn't think it was going to open up America to the United States to immigration from all over the world. They thought actually it was going to make it possible for more Europeans to come,
like Italians, Greeks.
Yes, but what happened is that that didn't happen because immigration from Europe fell flat, even though they could come, because there were openings in Northern Europe where the Southern Europeans went. At the time, Russians and Eastern Europeans, behind the quote Iron Curtain, couldn't even leave, so that it didn't operate the way they thought. I mean, but in fact, if we look at rather what they intended, right, or some of the limitations of the bill, Mae has mentioned that it actually put numerical limits on Latin Americans for the first time. I mean, they were qualitative restrictions on them migrating to the U.S., but not numerical. But if you look at the numbers, what happened after the law was passed, and we should also think of subsequent laws, because there was 65, then there was in 1980, there was the Refugee Act, and since 1980 there have been 3 million refugees who've been admitted. There was IRCA, 1986, 3 million, and then they could bring others in. 1990, the diversity visa program, which really opened things up to groups that did not have large numbers in the United States. The accumulation of 65 and these other legislation led to a huge change. The numbers, the numbers are extraordinary. They increased, and they steadily increased up till, Mae mentioned the 1,000 coming a year earlier on, but not 1,000, a million. Sorry, a million coming. But if you look at 2001 to the present, the U.S. has admitted a million. At least a million as permanent lawful residents with green cards every year. So we've
and just
now.
To pause, how does that compare to other countries?
It's more.
Yeah.
It's way more. It's way more. So the numbers have been enormous. As I say, 1/4 of the nation, but that actually includes the children of immigrants. But if you look at you go to 1960, say, right, which is before the act. So there were 10 million immigrants in the U.S. because there had been restrictions, there had been the Depression, there had been World War II. Those also were factors. So by 1960, there were 10 million immigrants in the U.S. They were 5% of the population. There are now 45 million immigrants as of 2020, and they are almost 14%, which is not quite as high as in 1890 and 1910, but it's almost. It's almost.
So LBJ was wrong when he says it does not affect the lives of millions.
It led to a huge increase, an astonishing increase in immigration, and it also changed the source regions or countries in a dramatic way. Because again, look at 1960, 75% of immigrants in the U.S. were from Europe. The figure now is 10%. Asians are, of the immigrant population, actually their percentage keeps going up. It's now, I looked at 31%. Latin American and Caribbean is about 50%. Even Africans are a group who benefited both from refugee law and also from the diversity visa program. They're now 6% of the immigrant population. So it's dramatically changed. We can say 1965, but also the subsequent legislation. And just one other thing just to add in terms of the numbers, maybe we should think of, although there are these numerical limitations that are part of the 1960 law and 5 law and part of the framework, the law also allows minor children, spouses, and parents of U.S. citizens to come in outside of the limit. And many immigrants, in fact, that's a motivation for many immigrants to naturalize. And you can naturalize after 5 years and for some 3, yeah.
And that was one of the things, the way they didn't think that that was one of the major clauses that allowed for the growth of immigration. And we see that when we tell our story of Mrs. Wong and at 103 Orchard, and when she becomes a citizen, she's thrilled to become a citizen because it enables her to send for her brother and then his family, who then she helps. And that's such a huge part. And it was funny because I was giving a tour to graduate students that were part of the Soros Fellowship in Partnership for a New American, and a lot of them had come through that, through family sending for other family, which had always been part of immigration before restriction. Family members are always paving the way and helping other family members, but this 1965 law made it and helped then accelerate the numbers who were coming.
The 65 law added parents to that non-quota category. Previously, spouses and minor children could come. But I want to add a little asterisk next to the million figure, because the actual number of visas available every year for new immigrants is only 26,500 per country. And most of that million is actually people who are adjusting their status. They marry a citizen, they, they have a job, they're here as a student and they get a permanent job. So a lot of those are adjustments of status.
That's why the word used is admission, rather than immigration. I mean, it's wrong to call them arrivals because they've already arrived. So it's really admission. But still, they're able to change their temporary status into a permanent status.
So the million is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
But we were bringing in 1 million people before World War I, and the population was so much smaller. So in proportion,
well, it's still 14%.
It's still a lot of people, and it's more than other countries. It's more than other countries admit as immigrants. That's absolutely the case.
But can I add one thing? But I think what's noticeable is that people think, well, million's not a lot, but people notice the immigrants because they're so different racially, right? So they're Asian, Latino, Black. So they're not like me. So I think that's why they think that million, or all of a sudden all these immigrants are here, and they're all immigrants because they see that they're non-white. And I think that's the big difference, the caveat that goes along with it. The immigrants haven't increased that much, but the kinds of immigrants, the face of immigration, has totally changed in America. So people just kind of really see it.
Right, and immigrants are now in every part of the country.
Exactly.
Whereas before World War II, they were concentrated in large urban areas, or maybe in the Southwest for Mexicans. But now immigrants and their children are in every major part of the country.
Right.
And how did immigration from Asia in particular change after 1965?
So before 1965, the Chinese and the Japanese were the largest groups here. They made up about 2/3 of all the Asians in the United States at that point. But now today, when you look at in 2020, the censuses tell us that Chinese is still up there, but we now have the second largest group are Indians in the U.S., then Filipinos, then I think Koreans, then I think Vietnamese. I might have mixed up Vietnamese with Koreans and so forth. So even among Asian Americans or Asians, people coming from the Asian continents or Asian countries are very, very different. And they're even more diverse in a city like New York City, where we have, I think, over 30 groups and 50 different languages. So everywhere. So that immigration law completely changed the face, the look of the ethnic groups. And then moreover, there was the class makeup also changed as well, because there was a preference too for skilled immigrants. So many skilled immigrants came here, were allowed to come here, though many of them ended up working class though, because they may not have been able to change their licensure if they were doctors or if they were chemists or different people had different professions in their home country. But they came here because of their class background. So we now have a very, very diverse Asian American population in the U.S. That is the look of it from many ethnic groups, but also we have a bifurcated by class. We have very wealthy Asian Americans, some who are able to keep their job statuses from their home country. And then we also have very, very poor. So when you look at the average income and the average education, they're above the median. So it just looks that way on numbers. But if you look at the population specifically and the kinds of jobs they actually have, we have a very, very diverse group of Asian Americans here.
If I can add to that, I think one of the ironies of the 1965 Act is, as Nancy was saying, they really thought more Europeans would come,
Right.
and members of Congress would say, "Well, don't worry about the Asians. They don't. They have so few. There are so few of them, and they won't be able to avail themselves of the family preferences. So don't worry about it. We're not going to have a lot of Asians."
But it's just so interesting that they didn't realize that it's built in. Once Asians came, then they...
Well, right. So the Asians use the occupational categories. So
Right.
think of the Filipino nurses, right? Chemists who went to work in the growing pharmaceutical company. These are areas that were deemed in short supply. And you also had a dynamic in Asia, especially in East Asia, where the number of college-educated professionals outstripped the development of those countries in terms of employment. So there were multiple reasons why professionally educated, especially in the STEM areas, came to the United States. And once they got here, they became citizens, and then they used the family preference categories. And so, and for the upper middle class people, even though they're using the family categories, they're really reproducing the same social class, right? So you have this dynamic of what my colleague Jennifer Lee calls hyper-selectivity, right? There's immigrants are always self-selected for certain reasons, right? And then there's a hyper-selectivity when the law favors some groups over others. And that, in large part, accounts for the preponderance of professionals among Asian Americans. And so we think, people think the so-called model minority is some kind of innate, smart nature of Asians.
It's just a consequence of the law.
But it's a consequence of the law. And, I tell my students, do you really think there's 1 billion doctors in China? So if you think about it, right, it's a product of the law and family patterns and chain migrations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that there are more people here that are educated and have college degrees than back in their home countries in each of these particular nations. So the highly, highly educated are the ones that select to come here because the laws actually allow them to come here too. So that's what we actually see.
But some of the figures are actually quite amazing. I mean, 80% of Indian immigrants over 25 have a BA or higher. I mean, the figure in the U.S. in general is like a third, 30. I mean, and the Chinese, that's a little bit over a head. Actually, one of the groups, just to add, since we broaden it beyond Asians a little bit, is actually the Nigerians, who about 62% have a BA degree or more. I mean, it's absolutely selecting, of highly educated Nigerians who are coming here. So I think, it's an interesting phenomenon, right?
And you've written about, too, how that has impacted the American economy. So how has this arrival?
Well, I mean, for example, just to give another figure, I feel like I'm a sociologist here, right, giving these figures, right? Okay. But 28% of physicians and surgeons in the U.S. are immigrants. I mean, that's quite an incredible figure, right? And, 16% of registered nurses. Silicon Valley, all right, which is heavily fueled by Indians and Chinese who are educated at, the elite universities in their home countries. Or in the U.S. Or in the U.S., right, who've come here, right? And so, Silicon Valley practically, is I have a figure of more than half of the 91 startups that are valued at over $1 billion or more were founded or co-founded by immigrants. So that's a pretty impressive figure. So, I mean, that's a key part of the American economy is high tech, and they're very important in that sector. So, and as Margaret mentioned, the downward mobility, I guess you could, from native-born Americans' point of view, and especially middle-class Americans, the fact that some professionals come here and can't practice. They don't have the licensing. Some of them don't speak English well. They don't have ties to the mainstream economy. And they're doing jobs well below their their
Yeah,
occupational
my
status. I
Uber.
mean, people will say, right, and
Yeah.
and the person who looking after your children or caring for the elderly may have a BA degree.
No, my Uber
Or
driver
more.
from Jordan was a pharmacist. So,
Yeah, a lot of Filipino domestic workers have
Or-
BAs and master's degrees in the Philippines.
Exactly.
But then there's also the
relatives.
lower
Yeah.
educated people
right, on the other
on
side.
the other side who fill the service economy as well, fill the bulk of the service economy from Latin America, Asia,
And in that case,
Africa.
they're mostly doing jobs that American-born people don't want to do.
Yeah, in some cases, yeah, that they don't want to do. But I have to say
Well,
that,
they might do it if they paid more.
yeah, that's right.
They used to do them, and they paid better.
That's right. That's right. I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, I was going to say but some of these folks who actually take the jobs that are lower paid, they feel like that is it's actually not paid so badly, you know. And these are some of the people that I've studied. It's better than what they would make in their home country, and this is from many different countries. You know, it's better than what they would make in their home country. They have a job here, even though they have a degree. A job doing some things here is better than what they have in their home country. And moreover, some people think, like these are some of the garment workers, you know, and the owners of some of the shops who actually were the Koreans, who actually were like chemists or they were managers or whatever, so they were able to manage a garment shop here. They felt like this is a way for them to make money here and survive in the U.S. and live in a better society than they would have back in wherever they came from. So this is 1980s, 1990s for Koreans, where they actually felt like the U.S. was the place to go. Shortly thereafter, many Koreans no longer felt that way because the Korean economy actually improved. So
There's also more democracy.
Exactly. More democracy. So they didn't want to come here. Exactly.
But I guess just to interject, you know, give it maybe a non-Asian example. But I mean, yes, people are often willing to do these jobs because they earn more than they could in their home country. Although over time they begin to see what people are earning, and it's less so. But they often define their stay as temporary. They think that they're going to go back. They're sending money to their families at home, right? They also come and they say, well, I'm not going to do so well, but my children. So they're willing to struggle. They're willing to make enormous sacrifices because they feel that their children will do better, you know, which is, of course, an age-old immigrant story. But this is a personal story because I started out as an anthropologist and I did my field work in a Jamaican village. And the woman that I lived with was a teacher in the community. And she came to the U.S. Actually to help her daughter get through university in Jamaica, and she was undocumented at first, and she lived in this terrible situation caring for an older woman. But in addition, for her part, she maintained her relations with other Jamaican women and her Jamaican community who recognized her as a teacher, as a person of status, so that she didn't. In fact, the thing that bothered her most about the job was that she couldn't tell the woman and her family that she had been a teacher because she was worried about that. And so, you know, she couldn't get that validation for her status. But amongst her friends, she did. Now, that's, you know, maybe an unusual case, but it gives you some of the dynamics, at least, that are involved in why people are willing to do these jobs. And as my students often tell me, they'll say, well, I'll ask this question in class, and they'll often say to me, they have no choice in terms of the jobs that they can get, because often they come, they don't have English, they don't, you know, the licensing issue, but even that, even people who don't have the advantages of having a lot of education, they don't, and especially the undocumented, have very little choice in what kinds of jobs they can get, no matter what their education levels. And so they're stuck getting these kinds of jobs.
When we interviewed Mrs. Long and also her children, and Mrs. Long came after 1965, as you know, and when we interviewed Yat Ting, her eldest daughter, and said, was working in the garment shops, was that liberating? Was that a liberating thing for her? And because there were a lot of things when drawing on Margaret's book, her wonderful book about having done all these oral histories with the garment workers, that there was elements of that work that was liberating in the sense that they were working, they were bringing in money into the economy, that was changing the family dynamic to some extent. But I love how Yat Ting answered that question, going back to what you're saying. She said, yes, it was liberating that she made money, but it was not liberating in that she didn't have a choice at what she was doing. But then this idea, right, and this is the story that comes up, as you well know, all 4 children, she pays for them to go to college, all of them do well, they have professions. And I think one of the things I go back to a lot is the study, Nancy, that I think that you sent to me, that Mary Waters had done, which was about, with the SAGE Foundation, I think, in 2016 or 2017. Am I getting that right? Where it was about kind of integration. It was a whole study on integration. Okay. Many different sociologists were involved in this study, but basically coming to the point that there are struggles, and yes, the children are going to know English better than their parents, but all sorts of things that were the case in 1900 as well, too, these dynamics, but that ultimately they talked about integration happens, like integration happens well in this country, and this was right before Trump was elected that this study came out. So I think of that all the time, that I think it landed on my desk maybe, November of that year. But why is it, with all of the studies that are done, and there's a new book out from Princeton of economists, and I'm blanking on the name, but it has
Streets of Gold.
Streets of Gold. There we go.
I don't like that.
Well, okay, so but I guess
I had a conference with the author.
So let's get into it, because now it's getting really spicy. The audience is
That's a very misleading. It's a very misleading study.
So it's a study. I'll just sum it up, and you can correct me. But basically saying that immigrants come, they have a positive net impact on the economy,
that part's right.
and on their own and their families' lives, like especially if you measure it with regard to like where their children are. And they made a big deal that they used Ancestry and they were able to chart all this stuff. But I remember I read it and thought, I've heard this before. Like these are, they might have done a different set of studies, but that idea that immigrants benefit the economy is one that's been shown over and over again. And I guess my question is, given that that's been proven from this field or that discipline or that, why is it that we still have to make that case today? Which is maybe another question we can go back to, but you can talk about Streets of Gold and what you like or dislike about it.
Well, first let me just go back a step, because I think this idea that immigrants come and they're willing to do the dirtiest and worst jobs because what they had at home was worse, and that they're willing to do it, I don't think we should exaggerate that point. I think it's true, but they suffer terribly, and I don't think anybody should be forced to work under the conditions that many immigrants in the service sector endure.
And you're saying this not just about today, but 100 years ago, or the mythic. Yes.
Okay, so as far as Streets of Gold goes, I don't want to pick on that book, but you brought it up.
You can blame me.
No, it is true, and they're not the first to say
I didn't write it. Also, just to be.
No, it is true, and they're not the first, of course, to say that immigrants have a positive net effect on the economy. That is very well established. What's interesting about their claim is that they say immigrants do progressively better, and they compare them to third and fourth generation native-born Americans. And they take out blacks, they say, for whites. So third or fourth generation native-born white American workers do not advance. Now, there's reasons for that, but to contrast that to immigrants who advance after the second and second generation, is the second generation bump, right, as we know it, that's also well established. If you get to the third and fourth generation of the foreign-born descendants, they stagnate also. So there's something about the American economy in the late 20th century that leads to that phenomenon. So it's a little misleading to say that immigrants come here and they find streets of gold, because if you come and you at a very low level and your kids do a little better, but then their kids actually don't even do that much better, then they're really on par with the third generation white Americans. So it's a very kind of strange conclusion that they draw from the data that they did. I mean, they did a lot of studies, and they studied everybody. Europeans, Asians, Latinos, Africans,
Well, there's a kind of like different, there's a lack of understanding of certain historical contexts in terms of comparing one era to another.
Well, I
Yeah,
think
and-
also in terms of the current era, I mean, there's been a lot of research on the children of immigrants and how they're doing, and there's been a lot of debates in the social sciences, because it was this notion of segmented assimilation and that they were going to do badly.
And what is segmented assimilation?
That you have to look at different segments of the immigrant population and see how different groups, different portions of it are doing. And
Or
some
you get channeled into
and
certain
some
parts
are-
of the economy.
the middle
labor market
and
is
then some are going
divided.
and some are going to be doing badly. Okay, but it was made a big deal about that a lot were going to be doing badly, and then came studies of the second generation, which showed that on the whole, as group-wise and they were doing better than their parents. Okay, that they were doing better. Now, of course, many of the parents weren't doing so well, so they were doing better than their parents. What we really don't know is how the third generation are doing.
Right, and
Because
there's
there
one
haven't
study, right.
been many studies of that. And so that's good. And now we're talking about 65, it's now 2024.
So
Right,
there
and
is a
then-
study. There is that study by Vilma Ortiz and Eddie Tejas called "Generations
Yes, of the Mexicans.
Generations of
Exclusion.
that showed the third generation stagnates.
And a
Yes.
lot of other studies do. For example, crime. We know
Right, and I
that
was-
immigrants commit fewer violent crimes than native-born. But then you go to the children, and they begin to look more like the native-born. They still do better than, and so there is this, yes.
And then so even in this other book that I wrote called Stuck, so they're the second generation.
Which
and
is,
the
by the
children,
way, another Tenement talk that you can see the full conversation about stuff.
So in Stuck, I look at the second generation or children of immigrants, the people born here, and the Asian Americans there don't do as well as people expect that they do, and they even think they ought to do better. And so these are all, either American born or they were raised here. So American raised or American born, they came here before the age of 13. And so many of the people I interviewed, and I have to say, I selected for these elite college graduates, and when people read it, they're like, wow, I thought they would do better. And so yes, they do well, but they don't do as well as some other groups or people think they ought to do. So already at that
their
level,
parents think
they
they
should do. Right,
Yeah, well, that's
right. Or the
another-
parents, right. That's a different story.
can't be having
Right. Yeah, that's a different story. The parents, have
Very high expectations.
yeah, very high expectations of these kids. But yeah, so for some of them, they don't. But they're completely adapted, to the U.S. They are integrated in a way that we talk about, in terms of that second generation study that you're talking about with Mary Waters and Phil Katzitz. So yes, the kids are integrated. But now as the kids are grown up, they realize that there are actually a lot of different structures that could be holding them back as well. And that's what we haven't studied, and we haven't studied the third generation either, or even more groups who have even reached that far of the children of immigrants or, born here or raised here.
One of the things that strikes me too is just how complicated all of this is, right? We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people. We're talking about 1/4 of the nation if we include
Right,
the children.
yes, it's a
so
huge number.
all of these, given that, right, all of these kinds of ways in which there are generalizations made about immigrants this or immigrants that, it's just the wrong framework for looking at what is going on in the country. I want to rewind a little bit because there's someone I said we would talk about last time and we haven't gotten to him yet, but he is a historical figure who was a congressman in the 1920s when the Johnson-Reed Act was passed and who fought vehemently against it and was unsuccessful. But what we pointed out last time is that he would have his day in the sun.
Mae Ngai.
Mae Ngai, yes, you correct. So tell us about what was Mae Ngai struggle, and how would he view 1965? Even again with all of the complications, but who was he? What did he represent? And how does he factor into the law?
I think he represented a district in
Brooklyn,
and
in
maybe
Brooklyn.
part of Manhattan, but mostly Brooklyn. And he was one of the longest-serving members of Congress. He was, represented a Jewish district. Was very progressive, very liberal, and spoke out in the 20s against the National Origins Act. He was one of the loudest voices against it, and he was always hammering at the racism of the 1924 Act. But the other person who I find actually more interesting is the Hart.
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 From Wisconsin.
No, Michigan.
Michigan. Oh, I knew it was
Philip
one.
Hart.
I know by
I knew it was
Wisconsin.
in the
Yes,
Midwest.
that's why.
Hart
That's my
Cellar.
New York.
So Hart was a senator. He was a liberal in the Senate who's known a lot for consumer protections and other civil liberties. But Hart didn't like the bill.
Interesting.
He actually had his own bill that he introduced before
Really?
what became
Okay.
Hart-Celler. And his bill was really interesting. First of all, he wrote the bill with the input of immigrant reform groups, refugee advocates, liberal lawyers, and it was a really complicated system. So he didn't think every country should have the same amount because countries are different. So he had a really complicated formula, but it made sense. It was like a certain portion, maybe half or 45%, would go to countries based on their relative size of population. So in that formula, India would get more than New Zealand. Okay. Then another portion, maybe 55%, I might be getting the percentages wrong, would go to immigrants who had relatives in the United States. And so it was a combination of family unification and population was kind of a proxy for need, right? And then he had carved out like 20% for refugees, which is a very large percentage.
Yeah.
And then he said Congress should review it every 5 years because he knew that things
would
change. So he didn't see it as a static thing. And so the Kennedy administration went to talk to him and they said, Phil, we want you to do our bill, not yours. And so he was pressured to sign on to Hart-Celler.
And why did the Kennedy administration dislike his bill?
I think I don't know exactly. I think they wanted something that was a one-size-fit-all. It was easy to explain. Everybody's going to be treated equally.
Maybe they thought it would have a better likelihood of passing.
Maybe that, too. They think they didn't want people from the global south, with countries with big populations.
From Asia, yeah.
From Asia, you know, or in Latin America. So, you know, when I wrote about the passage of this bill, and I went to look at Hart's archives. I went to Michigan. He has a big archive there, and he also has papers in Washington at the Library of Congress. There's nothing in his files about the Hart-Celler Act.
Wow.
He is not proud of that accomplishment.
Really?
Interesting. Interesting. But but there's material in his files about what he had proposed.
Yes, and there's also stuff about all his other accomplishments. You know, he wanted to be remembered as somebody who protected consumers. That was his big thing. But you can see, I mean, actually, I found the stuff about his bill in Herbert Lehman's files, interestingly. But who was another big advocate of immigration reform. But I think they all went for the Kennedy bill because it was, it had a certain elegance to it, right? We treat everybody the same.
And that was part of the influence of the civil rights era.
And unifying families. And the family thing was interesting. The family, it was like, because the law now, that as it was passed in 65, 80% of the visas go to family members in these different categories, and 20% go to employment. And actually, in the 1952 Act, it was mostly employment. And organized labor didn't want more workers.
And the 1952 Act was basically kind of affirming 1924.
Right.
But you know, it doesn't work out to be 80% when you look at the figures. It's about 2/3 come as family, on the basis of family. And the actual, maybe because of all the people coming in as relatives of citizens,
We'll bring a mathematician for the next.
No, I mean you see that in the literature.
Can I add something? I'm going to change the because I think that we're sitting in the Tenement Museum. So I think we should talk a little bit about New York City.
Yes.
Yeah, New York City. And so, you know, with the Asian immigration that was so huge coming in from 1970 to 2020 even. So at that point, I believe it was like Asian Americans were just 1.5% of the population. Now nationally, we're up to 7.2% of the population, from less than 1 million to 24 million Asian Americans. But in New York City, they're not 7%. They're actually 14% of the population.
14? Wow.
Yeah, 14%.
It may actually be 15
now. And I forget the actual number, but yeah, probably 15% of the New York City population. But the largest group still is Chinese here. And I'm going to focus on them just a little bit because if you look at Chinatown and where the Tenement Museum is situated, you actually can kind of see why Mrs. Wong moved here. When in the 1960s, Chinatown was just around Pell Street. It was Doyers and Mott, Mulberry, and that was it. It didn't go past Confucius. Well, Confucius Plaza wasn't even there, but it didn't go past Canal.
Like the Manhattan Bridge. Area.
Right, the Manhattan Bridge, it didn't go there. It was just at Baxter and Worth, and then to the Bowery and not north of Canal, not south of Worth Street at all. So it was very, very tiny. But now in 2020 or 2024, when you look at Chinatown, it's gone way past Little Italy, all the way up to Delancey Street, all the way out to here now, and all the way to the Two Bridges and down south. And West Broadway, pretty much.
And we have 3 new Chinatowns.
Exactly,
in Brooklyn and Queens.
And in Brooklyn and Queens is the largest, right, at this point? Or the population?
Yeah, I think it is. It's larger. Here it's actually a little bit, after 9/11, it shrunk a little bit. But you can see that increase in the Asian American population really changed the look and feel of Chinatown and really brought the Chinese here to the tenements, like Mrs. Wong.
Right, and thinking about Mrs. Wong being at the kind of the vanguard of that, right? That when she's getting here, she's part of forming that community that will come and will follow.
Well, if we're talking about New York, I always like to say, the famous book Beyond the Melting Pot, which was written in 1960, and it focused on 5 groups, right? The Irish, the Jews, the Italians, Puerto Ricans, and quote Negroes. And it sounds like, from our perspective today, like ancient history, right? Because it's changed so much in New York. You would never have a book, obviously, like that in many ways. But yes, the Asian population was completely invisible in that book.
And that was 63?
Well, there were very few. It was a very small community. It's grown enormously, right?
Yeah, but they weren't mentioned.
No, they were not mentioned. But if you look, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans are now the largest Latino group in New York City.
And the largest immigrant group.
Yes, and the largest immigrant group. And of course, there are people from all over Central America. Mexicans are one of the largest groups in New York. Now they started coming in the 90s. The black community, the non-Hispanic black community, I always like to say, if you put all the people from the English-speaking Caribbean together in New York as immigrants, they are the largest group. I mean, the non-Hispanic black community in New York is over a third immigrant, and then if you add on the children, it's much larger. Africans are new players and immigrants. A lot of African immigrants have come to New York and are coming to New York now. So, I mean, this is a very, and New York, by the way, continues to get European immigrants, I should say, larger than, I think something like 16% of immigrants in New York are European. So Eastern European immigrants are coming to New York. So New York is still a very, it's always been an immigrant city. And even in the low of the 1970, 18% was the lowest of the 20th century of immigration to New York. At least it was still 1.5 million people. It was still, there's always been a big immigrant population in New York. But it's changed, and it's changed the racial composition of New York. It's changed the neighborhoods of New York.
Thinking about
the post-65 immigration.
Well, I'm thinking about how that migration changed the city, like changed Queens, revived so many neighborhoods that had been actually declining, so that these are the groups that were creating stores, creating neighborhoods.
That's what immigrants do.
And in the 60s and 70s in New York, 2 million non-Hispanic whites left the city. They were leaving to the suburbs, to the Sun Belt. Without immigration, New York would not be what it is today. And, I always say the schools wouldn't be crowded, they'd be closed. I think it's thriving because of immigration. And
we can take that out to the country as a whole, because were it not for immigrants, if you just look at the native white population, it has a declining birth rate. Like in Europe or Japan, so it's immigration that keeps America growing, that feeds the economy, that brings creativity, innovation, and blood, sweat, and tears. You know?
Plus, if we look at the, to add to that, is that the baby boomers, who, what the figure is that in 2030, they will all be 65 or older. They're aging. It was a very big cohort.
Yeah, that would be us.
Yes, it was the cohort right after World War II for the next 2 decades. It's a huge cohort. They're going to be retiring and leaving the workforce. The fertility rates are way below a replacement level now in the United States. So who's going to do all these jobs at all levels of society, right? We do need immigrants. I mean, that's, we can, Trump may want to cut back on immigration, right? And they're in a very serious way. But there are going to be, forces that are going to be, wanting to continue immigration. So I think that without him, that's a big issue for the United States going forward. I think there will continue to be large-scale immigration.
Well, I think thinking about this phrase, we do need immigrants, and immigrants lead to revival, is a good way to kind of conclude this part of the conversation, seeing as we are at the Tenement Museum. But I want to open it up to the room for questions, and then we'll also open it up to our virtual audience too. But any questions in the room that we can take? And for those of you at home, please feel free to write your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to every one of them. And while people are thinking, the pressure's on to everyone in the room. While people are thinking, I will say that the next program that we'll be doing in the series is that of 1986, the IRCA law. That was passed under the Reagan administration. A really important law that we don't know that much about, but I think is important to bring up in this season. Mr. Gelwerg, Stewart.
Earlier in the talk, you talked about something that made me think of Emma Lazarus's poem, and it seemed like it was the '65 Act that said, instead of your tired, poor, and rich refuse, we want your educated, hungry but educated people.
We want your PhDs.
Yeah, we're cherry picking. That was a literal part of the '65 Act, or was that earlier?
I think that was the intent.
Oh, I should repeat let me repeat the question, because I'm not sure if everyone heard it. So our astute audience member referenced the poem, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, written in 1883, although was not put on the actual pedestal of the Statue of Liberty until 1903. Important to note that when the Statue of Liberty was put up, it had nothing to do with immigration. It was an engineering feat. It was originally supposed to be celebrating abolition, but that had been lost. Anyways, many layers to the Statue of Liberty, but the poem celebrated, and the poem, I think, really, during the decades of immigration restriction, ironically, was when it came to be read more and talked about more. But it was a poem saying, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I can actually recite it from the top, but I won't do it. That it's interesting that in the 1930s, 1920s, when the doors had closed, a lot of people like Celler or others who were advocating for immigration started to use this poem more and more to kind of build up a kind of this fight for, opening up the doors and letting more immigrants in. But the question, I know the question was it 1965 that kind of took away this idea that we don't want the poor, the huddled masses, but rather we want people who are educated to come.
That was said by critics of the law. Critics of the law said it was going to promote brain drain from the developing world. That there were jokes like that. Give me your PhDs. We don't want the huddled masses anymore.
But actually, immigration is, as my former colleague, right, Ari Zolberg used to say, makes strange big bedfellows. And in fact, although, yes, they wanted highly educated people, also employers aren't so interested in that. I mean, the agricultural industry, meat processing, I mean, you name it, a lot of big employer interests want immigrants who are going to do low status work, and they don't particularly actually want highly educated people to do it, because they're not going to be as happy doing the jobs, and they may be more difficult on the job or whatever. So I think is a demand, particularly on the part of many employers and
course.
businesses, for low-level workers in the U.S.
And
economy.
they really love undocumented workers.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, and it's not a new idea either. If you go back to the exclusion laws, the Chinese, they wanted people who could come over to, who had money. To
merchants were.
Merchants, yeah. So it's not an idea, it's not an idea that people hadn't thought about, that they wanted a certain group of people to come here that could be better accepted in a certain way. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Silas.
Yes, first off, thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about refugees and speaking to refugees, sort of what that looked like after 1965.
So the question is, what did the 1965 law have to say about refugees, and how did that change after the law?
Well, the law itself said very little about refugees. I think it allocated 6% of the total to refugees, and most refugee admissions up until 1980 were done on a what do you call it, an ad hoc basis. So they had specific laws. There was the laws that allowed Cubans to come in 1960-61. There was the Vietnamese refugees or the Indo-Chinese refugees. These are all done as ad hoc legislation. And in 1980, the United States passes the Refugee Act, which was for the first time. So all those other refugee programs were basically Cold War programs. The United States welcomed or helped people come from countries that were fighting communism. In 1980, the United States adopted the UN definition of a refugee, which is not any particular ideology, right? It's if you have a reasonable fear that you would be persecuted if you were returned to your home country on grounds of ideology or race or religion. They added gender later. So the United States was very late in adopting that formula that was passed in 1951 by the UN. By now, that's very out of date and really needs to be overhauled. It doesn't suit the world at this time in terms of refugee situations. But the 65 Act was just really kind of silent about it because they were using other means to deal with refugees.
And the president, according to that law, the president sets the
the
limit
number.
on the numbers.
And that changes every
year. And in
year.
fact, the numbers in the U.S. have been rather low over time,
And then
if you think about it.
Not always filled.
Well, and under Trump, they went down to practically nothing. And now they're up, they're higher right now, but there's such a backlog in processing that the numbers coming in are very small. So, I think I gave, from 1980 to now, 3 million have come in through refugees. That's a lot of years and not that many refugees, really. And, the refugee status, you have to get that outside the country, right? You have to go through all the procedures outside the U.S. before you can enter. And, of course, there are all kinds of programs for refugees. Yeah. And, of course, we now have, we haven't gotten to asylees. Asylees claim asylum in the U.S. Right.
For more information on asylees, actually, our September program dug into that with Moose Chishti and others, which was great. It was called Immigration Today, and it's on our YouTube library. Any more questions from the live audience? I see Alan.
Yeah, thank you. You hear in the news, it makes it sound with refugees like they, show up at the border and say, "Oh, I feel very unsafe," and they come through and they release them, and then they have to come back for some court date. Is that just?
I think
that's not refugees.
So the question is about kind of what is the
with refugees? Is that not?
Well,
No.
asylum
Just repeat the question.
asylum and a refugee is somebody who's in a third country, who's in a country not their own country, but not here, and they apply for admission.
okay.
An asylum seeker is somebody who is either already here or arrives and claims asylum. Now, by the law, anybody can enter the United States and say they want asylum. And so the Trump administration thought it was a big scam, right? And in fact, though, the people who are coming from Central America are fleeing conditions of violence, civil unrest, gang warfare, as well as poverty and economic conditions. And go through tremendous hardship to try to get to the border. So the fact that they're treated as illegal entrants is really a violation of both international law and U.S. law. And one of the things that Trump wants to do, if he were reelected, is to change the asylum law so that you can't do that anymore, and to really ramp up the conditions for like what you'd have to prove, to get asylum.
And I think
And he wants to detain people. Right now, it is true. I mean, the way the program is structured is that you have to then come back and reappear for your case, and most people do. They say this is just a way for people to come to the country and disappear. It's actually not true. I mean, people will show up for
it's
their
just that the
asylum
system
hearing.
is so backlogged that it does take years sometimes for court dates, and then there's also jobs. There's waiting periods before you can get a job. So I think most people would agree that the system itself is problematic and flawed. Even the people who are trying to help the asylees.
Maybe to get back to the 1965 law in a way, we can say that it's time for Congress to pass a law that will allow for more legal immigration, among other things. Right?
And to kind of fix a lot of these systems and
I mean,
processes and backlogs.
yeah.
I think that's...
I'm not...
Well, I think it's fair to say...
How optimistic are you?
I'm not that optimistic, but I mean, that's what...
We're going to book Nancy for December, where we're going to be celebrating the new
But
law that's passed in Congress.
I mean, the new law is not that they're talking about now is not so great, but
an overhaul, that there
hasn't been a major immigration law since 1990. We're in 2024.
And though I think it's fair to say that kind of work is going to take an acknowledgement of all of these complexities that were discussed today to really do it. And no one has right now in Congress, I think, the appetite or the practice of that kind of.
They don't have the will. Is what they don't.
No. But I guess it also brings up the fact that, the law can only do so. I mean, the law is a gatekeeping factor in that people in coming here. But what we haven't discussed, for another time, is what other factors are drawing people here, right? Why are they leaving, and why do they want to come here, right? I mean, there are a whole host of factors that are involved. It's not just the law.
Climate change, overpopulation.
And we haven't even discussed the 11 million who are undocumented, who have come often through, with a temporary visa and overstayed. About almost half of the undocumented do come with legally, they just overstay, and the others who are crossing the border, and that's another dynamic of the immigration system that's
and even their children,
yes.
The children who are brought here undocumented, or what we sometimes call the dreamer kids. So the children of the undocumented. What about them? You're not the ones born here, but they don't have any status, but they only know this country and no other country at all.
Well, and even the undocumented, to give another figure, 2/3 of the adult undocumented have been in the U.S. 10 years or more. Wow. It's a long settled, it's a settled population.
And 80% of Mexicans.
Yes.
Right.
So it's a very...
it does, I think about your book, your first one, about thinking about Francis Perkins' law, I think it's starting in 1938, of kind of recognizing that there were so many immigrants who had come without documents after 1924. And the recognition that they were now part of families and communities, and therefore there should be some kind of, I guess, I don't know if the word amnesty was used, but this idea of going to Canada and coming back and being able to be citizens. And in this very building lived Rosario Baldizzi, who benefited from that.
But they only let Europeans use it.
Correct. And it was Canada. And it was like you had to go to Canada for that.
So Mexicans were the...
But it had that but at the heart of it, though, was this idea.
Was that once you come and
you're part of families.
You shouldn't just be thrown out.
Other questions from... No questions online. All right.
I think
we're good.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not good. We have a lot of work to do. But I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I want to thank our wonderful live audience of educators from the Tenement Museum and special friends of the Tenement Museum and special new friends of the Tenement Museum as well. One day maybe you can be in our live audience. It all begins with membership. So if you like the program and like the Tenement Museum, I encourage you to become a member. I want to thank all of our donors and all of you who have created this marvelous community. So I hope to see you on Orchard Street and also online as well. Thank you so much, and thank you, Nancy, thank you, Mae, thank you, Margaret. And I just want to add, not only are they here tonight to educate you, but they have been part of the Tenement family for over a decade, probably in some cases 2 decades, teaching generations of Tenement staff about all of this, and we are never satiated, so they will, hopefully they'll come back and drink with us and eat with us again. Thank you very much, and buy their books. Their books are marvelous. All right, bye-bye.